Chapter 16 of The Man Who Lost Himself. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Man Who Lost Himself by H. de Vere Stacpoole. Chapter 16. A Wild Surprise. At 5 o'clock that day, the transference of the property was made out and signed by Marcus Mulhausen in Mortimer Collins's office, and the Glendoffwin lands became again the property of the Earl of Rochester, for the sum of £5,000 received and herewith acknowledged, said the document. Needless to say, no £5,000 passed hands. Collins, mystified, asked no questions in the presence of Mulhausen. When the latter had taken his departure, however, he turned to Jones. "Did you pay him $5,000?" asked the lawyer. "Not a cent," replied the other. "Well, how have you worked the miracle, then?" Jones told. "You see how I had them coopered," finished he. "Well, just as I was going to grab the kitty, he played the ace of spades, produced an old document he held against me." "Yes?" "I pondered for a moment, then I came to a swift conclusion, took the doc from him, and ate it." "You ate the document?" "Sure." Jones rubbed his stomach and laughed. "Well, well," said the solicitor with curious acquiescence and want of astonishment after the first momentary start caused by this surprising statement. "We have the property back, that's the main thing." "You remember," said Jones, "I talked to you about letting that place." "Carlton House Terrace?" "Yes. Well, that's off. I've made good. Do you see?" Yes," replied Collins. "I'll have enough money now to pay off the mortgages and things." "Undoubtedly," said Collins. "But now, don't you think it would be a good thing if you were to tie this property up, so that mischance can't touch it? You have no children, it is true, but one never knows. Honestly, I think you would be well advised if you were to take precautions." "Don't worry," said Jones brightly. "I'll give the whole lot to my wife, when I can come to terms with her." "That's good hearing," replied the other. Then Jones took his departure, leaving the precious documents in the hands of the lawyer. He was elated. He had proved the facts which he had not only guessed by instinct up to this, that a rogue is the weakest person in the world before a plain dealer, if the plain dealer has a weapon in his hand. The almost instantaneous collapse of Voles and Mulhausen was due to the fact that they stood on rotten foundations. He told himself now as he walked along homeward that he need not have eaten that document. Mulhausen would never have used it. If he had just gone out and called in a policeman, Mulhausen, seeing him in earnest, would have collapsed. However, the thing was eaten and done with, and there was no use in troubling any more on the matter. He had other things to think of. He had made good. He had saved the Rochester name and estates. He had recaptured £1,008,000, reckoning that the coal-bearing lands were worth $1 million, and more than that. He was a sane man, able to look after what he had recaptured. The Rochester family, if they knew, would have no cause to grumble at the interloper and the substitution of new brains and push in the place of decadence, craziness, and sloth. The day when he had changed places with Rochester was the best day that had ever dawned for them. He was thinking this when all of a sudden that horrible, unreal feeling he had suffered from once before came upon him again. This time it was not a question of losing his identity, it was a shuffle of his own taxed brain between two identities. Rochester, Jones. Jones, Rochester. It seemed to him for the space of a couple of seconds that he could not tell which of those two individuals he was. Then the feeling passed and he resumed his way, reaching Carlton House Terrace shortly after 6. He gave his hat and cane and gloves to the flunkey who opened the door for him. He had obtained a latchkey from church that morning, but forgot to use it, and was crossing the hall when a strain of music brought him to a halt. The tones of a piano came from a door on the right. Someone was playing Chaminade's Valse Tendre, and playing it to perfection. Jones turned to the manservant. "Who is that?" he asked. "It is her ladyship, my lord. She arrived half an hour ago. Her luggage has gone upstairs." Her ladyship! Jones, thrown off his balance, hesitated for a moment. What ladyship could it be? Not, surely, that awful mother? He crossed to the door, opened it, found a music room, and there, seated at a piano, the girl of the Victoria. She was in outdoor dress and had not removed her hat. She looked over her shoulder at him as he came in. Her face wore a half smile, but she did not stop playing. Anything more fascinating, more lovely, more distracting than that picture it would be hard to imagine. As he crossed the room, she suddenly ceased playing and twirled round on the music stool. "I've come back," said she. "Ju Ju, I couldn't stand it. You are bad, but you are a lot better than your mother and Venetia. I'm going to try to put up with you a bit longer. Ju Ju, what makes you look so stiff and funny?" "I don't know," said Jones, passing his hand across his forehead. "I've had a hard day." She looked at him curiously for a moment, then pityingly, then kindly. Then she jumped up, made him sit down on a big couch by the wall, and took her seat beside him. Then she took his hand. "Ju Ju, why will you be such a fool?" "I don't know," said Jones. The caress of the little jeweled hand destroyed his mental powers. He dared not look at her, just sat staring before him. "They told me all about the coal mine," she went on. "At least, Venetia did, and how they all bully-ragged you. Venetia was great on that. Venetia waggled that awful gobbly-jick head of hers while she was telling me. They're mad over the loss of that coal thing. Oh, Ju Ju, I'm so glad you lost it. It's wicked, I suppose, but I'm glad. That's what made me come back, the way they went on about you. I listened and listened, and then I broke out. I said all I've wanted to say for the last 6 months to Venetia. You know she told me how you came home the other night. I said nothing then, just listened and stored it up. Then last night, when they all got together about the coal mine, I went on listening and storing it up. Blunders was there as well as your mother and Venetia. Blunders said he had called you an ass, and that you were. Then I broke out. I said a whole lot of things. Well, there it is. So I came back. There were other reasons as well. I don't want to be alone. I want to be cared for. I want to be cared for. When I saw you in Bond Street yesterday, I Ju Ju, do you care for me?" "Yes," said Jones. "I want to confess. I want to tell you something." "Yes?" "If you didn't care for me, if I felt you didn't, I'd—" "Yes?" "Kick right over the traces. I would. I couldn't go on as I have been going, lonely, like a lost dog." She raised his fingers and rubbed them along her lips. "You will not be lonely," said the unfortunate man in a muted voice. "You need not be afraid of that." The utter inadequacy of the remark came to him like one of those nightmare recognitions encountered as a rule only in dreamland. Yet she seemed to find it sufficient, her mind perhaps being engaged elsewhere. "What would you have said if I had run away from you for good?" asked she. "Would you have been sorry?" "Yes, dreadfully." "Are you glad I've come back?" "I am." "Honestly glad?" "Yes." "Really glad?" "Yes." "Truthfully, really, honestly glad?" "Yes." "Well, so am I," said she. She released his hand. "Now go and play me something. I want something soothing after Venetia. Play me Chopin's Spianato. We used to be fond of that." Now the only thing that Jones had ever played in his life was the Star-Spangled Banner, and that with one finger. Chopin's Spianato? "No," he said, "I'd rather talk." "Well, talk then. Mercy! There's the first gong." A faint and far-away sound invaded the room, throbbed, and ceased. She rose, picked up her gloves, which she had cast on a chair, and then peeped at herself in a mirror by the piano. "You have never kissed me," said she, speaking as it were half to herself and half to him, seeming to be more engaged in a momentary piercing criticism of the hat she was wearing than in thoughts of kisses. He came towards her like a schoolboy; then, as she held up her face, he imprinted a chaste kiss upon her right cheekbone. Then the most delightful thing that had ever happened to mortal man happened to him. Two warm palms suddenly took his face between them, and two moist lips met his own. Then she was gone. He took his seat on the music stool, dazed, dazzled, delighted, shocked, frightened, triumphant. The position was terrific. Jones was no Lothario. He was a straight, plain, commonsensical man with a high respect for women, and the position of leading character in a bad French comedy was not for him. Jones would just as soon have thought of kissing another man's wife as of standing on his head in the middle of Broadway. To personate another man and to kiss the other man's wife under that disguise would have seemed to him the meanest act any two-legged creature could perform. And he had just done it. And the other man's wife had Hui! His face still burned. She had done it because of his deception. He found himself suddenly face to face with the barrier that fate had been cunningly constructing, and had now placed straight before him. There was no getting over it or under it. He would have to declare his position at once. And what a position to declare! She loved Rochester. All at once that terrific fact appeared before him in its true proportions and its true meaning. She loved Rochester. He had to tell her the truth. Yet to tell her the truth he would have to tell her that the man she loved was dead. Then she would want proofs. He would have to bring up the Savoy Hotel people, fetch folk from America, disinter Rochester. Horror! He had never thought of that. What had become of Rochester? Up to this he had never thought once of what had become of the mortal remains of the defunct jester, nor had he cared a button. Why should he? But the woman who loved Rochester would care. And he, Jones, would become in her eyes a ghoul, a monstrosity, a horror. He felt a tinge of that feeling towards himself now. Up to this Rochester had been, for him, a mechanical figure, an abstraction. But the fact of this woman's love had suddenly converted the abstraction into a human being. He could not possibly tell her that he had left the remains of this human being, this man she loved, in the hands of unknown strangers, callously, as though it were the remains of an animal. He could tell her nothing. The game was up. He would have to quit. Either that, or to continue the masquerade, which was impossible. Or to tell her all, which was equally impossible. Yet to quit would be to hit her cruelly. She loved Rochester. Rochester, despite all his wickedness, frivolity, shiftlessness, and general unworthiness, or perhaps because of these things, had been able to make this woman love him, take his part against his family and return to him. To go away and leave her now would be the cruelest act. Cruel to her, and just as cruel to himself, fascinated and held by her as he was. Yet there was no other course open to him. So he told himself, so he tried to tell himself, knowing full well that the only course open to him, as a man of honor, was a full confession of the facts of the case. To sneak away would be the act of a coward. To impose himself on her as Rochester, the act of a villain. To tell her the truth, the act of a man. The result would be terrific, yet only by facing that result could he come clear out of this business. For half an hour he sat, scarcely moving. He was up against that most insuperable obstacle, his own character. Had he been a crook, everything would have been easy. Being a fairly straight man, everything was impossible. He had got to this bedrock fact when the door opened and a servant made his appearance. "Dinner is served, my lord." Dinner! He rose up and came into the hall. Standing there for a moment, undecided, he heard a laugh and looked up. She was standing in evening dress, looking over the balustrade of the first landing. "Why, you are not dressed," she said. I forgot," he answered. Something fell at his feet. It was a rose. She had cast it to him, and now she was coming down the stairway towards him, where he stood, the rose in his hand, and distraction at his heart. "It is perfectly disgraceful of you," said she, looking him up and down and taking the rose from him, "and there is no time to dress now. You usen't to be as careless as that." She put the rose in his coat. "I suppose it's from living alone for a fortnight with Venetia. What would a month have done?" She pressed the rose flat with her little palm. Then she slipped her fingers through the crook of his elbow and led him to the breakfast-room door. She entered and he followed her. The breakfast-table had been reduced in size, and they dined facing one another across a bowl of blush roses. That dinner was not a conversational success on the part of Jones, a fact which she scarcely perceived, being in high spirits and full of information she was eager to impart. It did not seem to matter to her in the least whether the flunkeys in waiting were listening or not. She talked of the family, of your mater, and Blunders, and V, and other people, touching, it seemed, on the most intimate matters and all with a lightness of tone and spirit that would have been delightful, no doubt, had he known the discussed ones more intimately, and had his mind been open to receive pleasurable impressions. He would have to tell her directly after dinner the whole of his terrible story. It was as though fate were saying to him, "You will have to kill her directly after dinner." All that light-hearted chatter and new-found contentment, all that brightness, would die. Grief for the man she loved, hatred of the man who had supplanted him, anguish, perplexity, terror would take their places. When the terrible meal was over, she ordered coffee to be served in the music-room. He lingered behind for a moment, fiddling with a cigarette. Then, when he came into the hall with the sweat standing in beads upon his forehead, he heard the notes of the piano. It was a mazurka of Chopin's, played with gaiety and brilliancy, yet no funeral march ever sounded more fatefully in the ears of mortal. He could not do it. Then he turned the handle of the music room door and entered. Chapter 17.